All right, all, let's get to it. So today we're going to kind of start reviewing topics. I actually kind of stopped that. Really, I want to bring together some of what we've talked about and start the work of becoming culturally competent human services providers and culturally competent in our classroom placements. So we talked a lot about different concepts from the book. And after some thought, I don't like the way the book has guided. Um, the book doesn't provide kind of the type of cultural competency skills path that I would prefer. So I'm gonna say, after we've read what we've read about child development and about some cultural differences in child development, I want to bring together how we develop cultural competence and cultural humility and what this looks like in the classroom and how we do the work to become culturally competent educators or human services providers. So here's all I have: course updates and reminders, and then cultural competence. We're going to review the key terms. I have a few different videos, and then I want us to start working on our own identities, because the first step to becoming culturally competent is knowing who you are and what makes up your own identity. And then the next steps, which I'm going to talk about next week, are, okay, what are these gaps in my knowledge? Where do I might potentially possess some implicit bias? And I'm going to talk about that as well, what that is. And then how do I work to correct those? So again, I want to, as always, provide an update and reminder of what we typically do. Weekly expectations: watch the lecture, complete the exit ticket, and post to the discussion board. Your course requirements are the field assignments, are your field placements, so your timesheets, your final reflection, which has been posted to Blackboard, and your teacher evaluation. And then I had tried to add reflections, but that seemed to be an unclear component. So all you have are your quizzes. The first 7 quizzes, which are on chapters 1 through 8, are due by October 31st. I haven't posted chapter 9, I think because I know it's not really expected to be due for a while. I'm not concerned, but it will be posted tonight. And then you'll have a final exam. I will likely start creating the final exam this month and post it, because I want you to have as much time as possible to work through it. I'm not someone who likes timed tests. I think that's silly. I don't even like in-class exams. I prefer take home anyways, and that's what I want. I want you to have time to work through the questions. All right, let's start. Review of key concepts. How does this fit into our practice? So here are some critical terms. I went over them last week, but I wanted to put them here again. And then I have some videos to accompany them that will really create the bulk of this lesson today. Remember, cultural competence, it's, our affect, our what we're thinking about, and then what we show people. And how we're able to allow people to be comfortable from a culture that might be different from our own. It also means there are going to be differences in behavior and appearance, likely because of those cultural differences. And what we're trying to do is learn as much as we can as about those differences. That's our competence. Cultural humility is that lifelong commitment to constantly reflecting on how are you interacting with other people, and how are you interacting with people whose cultures are different from your own. I'm not going to say too much because the videos are going to be helpful in really clarifying these concepts. So this is cultural competence explained by young people, and I think this is helpful because this is a class that is not, I teach an early childhood class using the same book, but these are not concepts that are just for early childhood. So I want to make sure that we cover the gamut or the range of ages that you might meet if you work in human services or in schools specifically. So let's check it out.
To me, I think that cultural competency is just being able and willing, not necessarily comfortable with, but willing to work with, learn about, or engage with different cultures. That means that you can work with a broad array of people, but you can also engage with that community of different people that may not look like you.
True cultural competency and acceptance also means recognizing that those cultural backgrounds may make people respond to conflict differently than you do. They may make people communicate differently than you do, and that might happen in ways that are sort of off-putting, and you can't negatively respond and immediately say, oh, well, this person's a poor communicator, or oh, I don't like this person's approach to conflict, without understanding that there are so many more factors at play there.
The whole purpose of diversity is diverse thoughts and opinions, right? Like, it goes beyond race or religion. There's so much more to it.
It's not always super comfortable. It's not always super fun to think, I did it this way my entire life. I thought that's how everybody did it. Well, that's a strategy that works for you, and that's awesome. And there's also different strategies that work for different folks. And it doesn't make either of them wrong. It just means that we experience things differently.
People need to be aware that there isn't just one issue that somebody is facing or a certain select group of people are facing. There's a lot of cultural groups that are continuing to face many issues.
As long as you're having those open, honest conversations, I think that we are able to move the needle a little more forward, because then they might be interested or curious, like, okay, well, what is outside of the street that I live on or the town that I live in? And then they will start to come across people that look different from them, act different from them, eat different foods, and they might be more open to those things.
I feel like it's so many of us is like stay in what makes us comfortable, stay in a little bubble of what makes us comfortable. And I can relate to that, needing that comfort. I can understand that, but at the same time, you cannot get to experience so many other people from so many different points of views if you don't get to step out of that comfort zone.
Being able to understand the differences that each of us has and using that and being able to be spoken about those differences in uncomfortable situations, that is what diversity and inclusion is.
I really feel like that a single conversation can lead to a whole world of understanding.
We have these common stories that we know, but by creating more stories about and with people of color or people who identify as queer, you're creating more visibility, which creates more space, which creates more collaboration, which is what the goal needs to be, to create a healthy and diverse and open community as a whole.
It's easiest to just share your experience and just make yourself vulnerable, and when people see that it's a safe space, then they're willing to share their experiences as well.
The best way to become more inclusive is asking somebody about that, talking to somebody about their differences, and being willing to learn and educate yourself on somebody else's experiences, their culture.
That's what creates a functioning world. If we all thought the same, we wouldn't have all these great inventions and ideas, right?
Diversity is literally different experiences and different lives in general.
What led to us having different experiences? Was it purely our human control, or were there some societal impacts that were contributing to that?
We really will be the generation that's gonna want to learn more, and that'll push others to learn and push others to question their beliefs.
So that's kind of, I wish it was more, but the idea being that we accept the competence is understanding that there are going to be different ways of being. You can see what I listen to. Here is a brief overview of cultural humility, which I think is really, it's 60 seconds, so it's even quicker. So let's see this.
Cultural humility is a practice of approaching people from different cultures with an attitude of respect and a willingness to learn. When entering a relationship with another person, your intention is to honor their beliefs, customs, and values. It involves acknowledging and challenging your own cultural biases or...
And that is one of the things that we're going to start working on, is acknowledging and challenging our own
assumptions, as well as becoming aware of power imbalances based on things like culture, race, or ethnicity. Cultural humility is not about being an expert on other cultures but recognizing that each person's experiences and perspectives are unique and valuable. It aims to promote mutual understanding, trust, and collaboration. You must realize that you cannot possibly know everything and approach relationships with openness and curiosity.
So I'm going to stop it there because it is a lot more repetitive. But to me, really, the quote that lives with me forever is, "You don't know what you don't know." And it's true. There are a lot of things I thought I knew that I didn't know that I now know today. And cultural humility is accepting that. Cultural competence is what you possess and how much you are learning about unique cultures, right? Competence is the knowledge you have. Humility is understanding that you don't have all of it. So to wrap it more together about, well, what does this mean when we're looking at a classroom? Again, I like using videos because especially this video uses pictures and images. I think this really illustrates why it is so important to engage in exercises that build our cultural competence and assuming cultural humility being a value that you're constantly learning. So let's take a look. And when we're talking culturally relevant pedagogy talks about specifically instruction, but this particular video actually really talks more broadly about the classroom and education. That's why I like it.
Gloria Ladson-Billings says cultural relevant pedagogy rests on 3 propositions: academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political consciousness. Cultural competence, however, says Billings, is the most misunderstood. The root of this misunderstanding is the simplistic notions many teachers have about culture. Teachers often reduce cultural relevant pedagogy to a set of techniques. If I hang a Mexican flag up, talk about my trip to Japan, or quote, did or read something black, end quote, then I must be leveraging culture. There is a quick fix, give me the remedy for these kinds of students' approach that generalizes, quote, static, naive notions of culture that serve to further distance professionals from the people they serve, end quote. Culture, of course, is dynamic, constantly changing, and complex, and quote, no teacher education course can ever cover every potential cultural conflict. Learning these nuances of cultures takes deliberate study, end quote. An example of a cultural misunderstanding for Billings is this, quote, a young, progressive teacher with a more informal demeanor entering an urban classroom serving African American students, suggesting that students call him or her Wendy or Phil, may be unwittingly setting up a cultural conflict. In communities where I grew up and later worked, all adults, regardless of official status, were spoken to and about with a title, Miss, Mrs., Mr., Auntie, Uncle, Reverend, Doc, or some form of differentiated status. This is considered a form of respect, and children are not permitted to violate that norm. Telling children they can call you by your first name lowered their respect for you. And I've seen many a classroom devolve into chaos, in part because it was not clear who was the adult and with what authority people operated. Both Billings and Hawley describe the different interaction styles and worship methods of church as a tool for understanding how home culture and behaviors may be contrary to those expected in the school setting. Hawley says, imagine that you are attending a spiritual service of any type. You are a visitor and not a subscriber to the faith. As the service begins, you immediately notice the differences in your usual spiritual service and the service you are attending. Your home service starts with a boisterous praise and worship. People are on their feet, singing and clapping. This service starts with a silent prayer and a calming hymn. Your home service allows for expected interactions in the pulpit through a process known as call and response. This service does not. In fact, you have the accurate feeling that if you shout out amen, you might be asked to leave.
And I will say, so this is one of the differences that I definitely have seen moving around more into more diverse regions of the country where I grew up, though I wasn't raised this way, my parents were raised Catholic. And Catholic a Catholic mass is quiet. Um, if people speak, they speak in unison, they do not shout. If people sing a hymn, they sing in unison, there's no yelling. Um, it's a very, I don't wanna say mundane, but it's not an exciting service. That's how I've always viewed Catholicism, whereas if I've been to I went to a service in North Carolina that was again, it was not Catholic, and it started with, a Christian rock band singing praise songs, and they put the lyrics up on a large, um, projector screen, and people sang along. That was so new to me because I had been raised in much of New England, because of the Roman Catholics and Irish Catholics is very Catholic. At least, and especially New Hampshire, Massachusetts, whereas I moved to Rhode Island, then I found the diversity of different churches. I had a lot of people inviting me to different churches, even from the school. But this is one major difference, and I wanted to call this out because if you have students who represent a faith different than your own, you also might see differences in how they act within this type of classroom environment too. This will come up too in when you read chapter 9 about attachment. There's a lot of very distinct cultural variations that lead to some not odd, I'm sorry, some personality differences. At least for me, again, growing up in that type of household, growing up in a community that celebrated Catholicism. My grandmother was constantly trying to convert me, get me baptized, all that jazz. Um, Moving into someplace different, oh, what an eye-opener. Alright, sorry.
Now, as an observer to this experience, the question becomes, would it be wrong or simply inappropriate culturally if you were to shout amen during the sermon in the context of this service? The answer to that question is the understanding of how to infuse culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy into any classroom management system. Billings also uses differences in worship styles to demonstrate to her student teachers how behavior from one cultural context can be misinterpreted as misbehavior in another. Quote, "The traditional 2-hour black service is always an eye-opening experience for my students. Those not socialized in these cultural spaces are often shocked by the degree of responsibility that children, even very young children, have. Some are ushers, others may be choir members, and still others may be in charge of making church announcements. The very children that many school personnel argue have ADHD or some other emotional malady can be seen sitting for long stretches of time and participating appropriately in the service. In those instances, I ask students to think about the nature of the service and how it might contrast with the school setting. Typically, the students point out the interactive nature of the church service. Traditional black preaching is a dialogue where congregants are not expected to sit silently and listen. No, a good sermon is where the congregation talks back. To be culturally relevant, teachers must, quote, take the initiative to learn about the communities they work, end quote. Billings recommends that teachers visit grocery stores, health facilities, after-school programs, and especially churches. Self-reflection and openness to new experience and ideas are essential for culturally relevant teachers, not only to leverage a student's home culture, but to stave off the instinct to see differences as a deficit. This mind shift change, as Holly says, is important for embodying positivity in the classroom. Being positive for Holly means not allowing the student's behavior to turn the educator negative, resulting in such situations where the teacher is not smiling, is not enjoying coming to work, and is not finding the spark that matters so much in teaching. In other words, the teacher has become a negative source in the classroom because of the student's behaviors. Next week's video will discuss more.
All right. So I think that's a really nice kind of introduction to what we do to become more culturally competent and relevant. So there were some very specific strategies. I don't think we're ready for that yet, because this person was really talking from this viewpoint of if you are from this um, unique cultural background, we need to make sure we understand who we are. And so here, I kind of have two ways of thinking about it. Who am I is typically comprised of your culture, which specifically could be the geographical area, your personal or familial values and beliefs, family orientation. So what role does your family play in your life? What arts and leisure activities do you engage in? What's your gender identity and sexual orientation? And then what's your age and ability? I'm going to go into those on my own. So ethnicity is specific to your country or continent of origin, what social group or groups belong in, and what religious groups, if any, do you. And then race is where we're talking specifically, Native American, American Indian, Black or African American, Hispanic and or Latino, Latina, Latinx, Caucasian, me, white, Pacific Islander, oh my gosh, and I don't even have like, there's Asian Pacific Islander, Asian, this is more calling to the different types. Or we can look at it as, who am I centered around these different pieces? What are maybe my physical characteristics? What are my personality characteristics? How does my significant other or others? So for me, part of who I am is also based on my failed relationships or marriage. So that would be a critical piece of who I am, is that one of my significant others who is very important to me is no longer that same part of my life. My childhood experiences, I've talked a little bit about how for a long time I questioned not necessarily my gender identity, but my own, how my characteristics fit into my gender identity, and realize that those two things do not need to fit together for me. The roles that you take on in your life. So I am a teacher, I am a niece, I am a mother, a stepmom, I am a daughter. Education, so I am, you would say, well educated, so I have a master's degree. Um, and I am employed fully by CCRI. My groups, so social groups, I would say if I were to think about it in terms of class groups, I would be, middle class. Other groups, I think of ability groups. So I consider myself neurodivergent, and that's a critical part of my identity. And institutions is more, what institutions impact you? How do they impact you? This one's a little bit more difficult. So like, there is your education, but like, what is your level of education? Then there's the impact of different institutions. So if you, there's an impact of the educational institution if you are in a public school. Regardless of the level of education, if you went to a public school in Providence, you suffered from what I call systemic racism, because you went to a school that was low resourced in comparison to others, because those who could afford sent their children to private. And thus there's very little money left for our public schools, which means that your institution highly affected how you live because you went to a low resource school. And then geographic location. As you all know, I grew up in New Hampshire. I consider myself obviously a New Englander, but I also consider myself someone from the Merrimack Valley, which means for me, there's a certain characteristic of those people. One in particular is we all play a card game called 45s. So here's what I would want you to do. And this is an activity that you're going to post to the discussion board. You are either going to review these characteristics, choose those categories that are most important to your identity. So not all of them. My family orientation is kind of questionable at this point. I think they're important, but I also need space because of the trauma I've endured. But something that is very important to me is that I'm neurodivergent because it's helped me understand how to support myself better and why did I feel so different for so long. So you identify what's important to you, then identify yourself based on those categories, and then you can create either a visual depiction, it could be a picture, it can be computer generated, I don't care, or written narrative using this information describing your identity. Similarly, you can use the information here that I just described, and you can create this visual, put yourself in the center, and then these different pieces that are important to you on the outside circle. Similar though, you can either use this and just use text, or you can try and make it more visually interesting. I don't really care. It's whatever you think works best for you. So I'm just going to use the straight bullets, but I do prefer that you use the narratives. So like I said, I'm a New Englander. Some of my values that are important to me are authenticity, autonomy, and compassion. Compassion drives me. I'm a very empathic person because of the way I was raised. And I try to use that as a strength rather than a deficit, though it's difficult. Autonomy, the ability to make my own decisions, has always been critical to me to a fault. And authenticity. I genuinely struggle when I feel like people are not being their authentic selves. I've had arguments with my brother about this, sadly. Those values are true to me. If you know me, you know I am authentic, I am autonomous, and I'm very compassionate. I am a singer, songwriter, let's just say singer, but it is a big part of my life. And in my spare time, if I could write more, I would. I am a woman. That's very important to me. Do I see myself as an extremely feminine woman? Maybe not. But I do feel like I am a woman and I embody what a woman is. And very important to me is that I'm neurodivergent. Now, my race, maybe this isn't important to me, but it's important that I acknowledge that I am white because it carries privilege with it. And remembering that I am white and that I carry privilege allows me to be much more aware of where, one, my biases might lie, and two, how, today my privilege definitely infiltrated one of my lessons. In an icebreaker I gave to my students, I asked campfire or fireplace. And I didn't realize until after the fact that there are many students who have never even seen either. That's my privilege, that I've had the experience of sitting by a campfire and sitting by a fireplace. And then ethnicity, I'm American, I'm a middle-class, well-educated person, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, that's one of my groups. I'm without doubt an advocate for special populations and specifically parents. If you are a parent of a child in special education or with a disability, I'm going to want to know your story. And also, I put this here because I've been exploring it for a while, but again, as you know, I was raised in a Catholic family. I don't really care for Catholicism. It's based on a lot of guilt, but I do believe in a higher power. I do believe that one exists. I just need more time for me to form my own, to just not decide, but just understand what faith makes most sense in my identity. But I believe in God, or I'm heading towards that, but it was not how I was raised. However, that is important to me. So this is an additional discussion board, but I hope it's fun. I want you to review the characteristics in either the graphic or the text, then choose the categories most important to your identity, identify yourself based on those categories, and create a visual depiction or written narrative with this information. If you do the visual, just create labels so I understand what it says. And that's it. So I have a wrap up here, but all we talked about, we reviewed cultural competence and humility. We learned more about cultural competence in the classroom. And then we started exploring our own identities. All right. I'm trying to make my PowerPoints quicker. Next week I'm going to work within your posts to the discussion board. And I want to use what we've done so far in our future classes. And that's all I have for today. So please complete your exit ticket and you will be done. All right. All righty.